So this project had set dimensions, but the design was left to me. So I had open license to kind of do what I want. I knew I wanted to make it out of reclaimed materials, so I started sizing up one of these big chunks of white oak I have, and these I got from a local crane company. They use them as levelers on pavement and in people's yards for the outriggers on their trucks. So you could see there's hardware going to the center of them, which is why I'm kind of making this groove on the top so that I could then put a sawzall in there and cut those bolts so that I could get these into two pieces without messing up the blades on my saws. So then once I had that groove, I was able to fit a demo blade on my sawzall in there and cut those bolts in half. And once those were in half, I could flip it upside down and continue cutting this piece in half as well. So I basically had a rough plan in my head for this project to start, but it was definitely a go with the flow sort of piece. So I basically just wanted this white oak. I wanted two solid chunks of it, which was going to be the legs of the piece. So I was able to get this mostly cut apart, but there was still a piece hung up on there, which is kind of common with this reclaimed lumber and nothing square. So a swift chuck on my shop floor, and I was able to break it into two pieces. And then I had to tackle taking out the hardware, which was a real pain because I'm assuming it was put in there when this wood was still green, so the wood kind of shrunk around it a little bit as well as rusted. So that was a task to be had, but after a little bit of work I was able to get all that hardware out as well. So there was a lot of checks and cracks in this wood, and I kind of cut it in half in the spot where I utilized the best pieces. So now that it was in half, I sized it up and squared up the edge and got two chunks. The second chunk has a really nice piece of figured oak that I was trying to keep. It was a little bit of a pain, the whole process keeping that figured part, but it ended up working out because it did look really nice once everything was done. So the two rough chunks I ended up with were roughly a little over 3 by 3 inches square, and then now that I had them down to size, I could send them through my planer and clean up those cut edges as well as the faced edges, because this piece I'm not going to keep the rough sawn look of the outside. So for the portion of this build that's going underneath the couch, I'm using some sweet gum because I have it in the same type timber, the same larger dimensions, because you're going to need that to hold up the counter lever of the tabletop. And I did the same exact thing. I rough cut it down to size and then put it through the planer. And when I put the sweet gum through the planer, I also put that leftover middle section of that piece of oak, because that is going to be the arms for the top part of the table. So once this is all done, I have all of my pieces dimensioned. So then for the tabletop, someone gave me a couple slabs of cherry lumber, live edge cherry lumber, a little while ago, and they have a nice crotch in all of them with nice figure right down the center. So I decided to use that for the top. So to start off, I started hand planing it down to get as flat of a surface as possible. Once I had it fairly flat, they weren't super warped, they just had some hills and valleys in them. I decided to cut it down to rough size, which would then make the final planing go a lot quicker because I would have less material to work with. So just kind of cut off the end because there were some checks in it. And then once again, this sizes are based on the dimensions I got, so it couldn't be longer than I think 22 inches long by about 16 inches wide. And with these live edge pieces, I'm kind of my preference is to usually put curves on things, but with these live edge pieces I just feel like they look the best when the shape is kept pretty square with square corners. So I just played around with those shapes and drew some lines out on it, and my camera wasn't filming when I cut it, so you just kind of see the aftermath of those cuts. So with the top rough planed, I switched gears and went back to working on the legs. I was basically just cutting my pieces down to size, so I was cutting off those curved bottoms and tops off of them to rough size. So my radial arm saw, where the motor is housed hangs pretty low, so you can't cut super thick lumber on this, but luckily I was able to kind of cut off the ends because it doesn't hit the motor, and once I had that done I had to finish everything up with the circular saw. So these pieces are going to have the holes left over from the hardware, which I end up filling with 5/8 inch dowels, but I was basically cutting them, I think, roughly to about 28 inches tall, and I was trying to keep the most interesting parts of the pieces while I did it. I also cut down the sweet gum, which was going to be used, like I said, underneath the couch. So the pieces for the sweet gum were roughly about 3 inches wide by, I think the end dimensions ended up being about 2.5 inches tall. And I made those about as deep as the cherry would be. You want them to cantilever about as much as your top does. I'm going to attach this with a circular dowel. So I chose to do a dowel because I can make them rather quickly, and I could then make my tenons using a hole saw kit and just chisel out the excess. I wanted this to be a big hefty tenon floating in the middle there, so that was kind of the fastest, easiest way to do it on these irregular shaped pieces in my shop. So I just lined up the pieces and drew center, and then with those sector marks I could use my hole saw kit to drill those out, and I think it ended up being like a 1.5 or 1 3/4 inch hole. So you could see coming up, this is kind of the catalyst for me having built that end boring jig. In order to drill into the end piece of that sweet gum, I had to kind of take apart my drill press, lower it as low as possible in order to drill those pieces. Luckily sweet gum isn't a super dense wood, so I was able to kind of use a clamp to hold it in place while I drilled those holes in the end of that sweet gum. So chiseling out all that wood and end grain's pretty tough, so to expedite the process I took a pretty big Forstner bit and drilled out a lot of the center of that hole that I made with the hole saw, and then I could just chisel out that rim, which ended up being a much faster process than trying to chisel out that end grain all at once. And then for the pieces in the oak, it's not end grain, it's edge grain, so that went really fast. I just curved it up and chiseled those pieces out as well, so then I had these two circular mortise holes. So like I said, I think these holes were about 1.5 inches. I actually made this about a month ago, but it wasn't delivered until this past weekend, which is why I'm posting it now. But I think those holes were about 1.5 inches. And then in order to get the tenon, which was going to be basically a dowel, I had a spare piece of poplar laying around, and it was really easy, since it was already square, to slowly knock down the edges with a hand plane and turn it into a circle. So this is obviously a longer process than just having a dowel, but I do like this sort of work, and it does go by quickly. So you can see I'm slowly knocking down those edges and then gauging it off of the hole saw to get the size. Once I had that, it's just a matter of you keep turning it in the vise and turning it into a circle. Once I had that rough circle, I was able to hand sand it down to size. And then it was easy to finish up that shape with a little hand plane, getting it to be the right size, testing it as I went in order to make sure that it would fit on both ends. So then once I got it down to size and it fit in there, I was able to cut it down to size on my radial arm saw and then glue all those pieces together. So you could see I have two nice big mortises with a huge circular tenon in there, and with all that glue and clamping it together, this is going to be a nice strong joint. So I clamped that together and let it set up overnight, and now I had two square blocks to work with. The next day I took the clamps off, and then I started forming the shape, and I had a rough idea of what I wanted in my head, so I used my set of French curves in order to get nice curves on the top. And my bandsaw is not super great. Cutting this would have taken forever on there, so I opted to use my chainsaw to rough cut out the initial shape, which was basically just a curve on the top, a curve on the bottom, and then an inner concave curve between the top and the bottom. So you could see me cutting that out with the chainsaw there, and then just kind of rounding off that bottom. So once I had those cuts, it's really easy to clean up those chainsaw marks with an abrasive disc on my angle grinder. And this is the piece with that really nice oak figure, which you can't really see now because of the burn marks from the tooling, but towards the end this one was harder to work because the figure is harder than the non-figured parts, and it's harder to carve, but it ended up being worth it. So that's kind of what it looks like before and after. And then once I had that shape, I kind of went back to the drawing board and decided what else I wanted. So then I used the chainsaw to kind of chamfer those edges. This is basically just saving me time for using the hand tools. Cutting off these chunks is not necessarily final shaping, but it will reduce the amount of time I have to spend with the other hand tools, which don't cut obviously as fast as the chainsaw. So it was just a matter of cutting off that excess wood and then using the angle grinder to smooth everything out. So then once I had those two pieces with the curves and the chamfers, I marked top and bottom because I wanted the inner portion to be skinnier. I wanted it to flare out at the top and the bottom. So then once again, I'm taking that chainsaw and cutting curves on the two sides as well. And then that would be it for the chainsaw. So you could see what that looks like. I have kind of a fat head, a fat bottom, and then a skinny midsection on my pieces. So it's easiest to carve these things when they're smoother surfaces. So before I started using my Dremel, I smoothed this up with my belt sander, and then these are the bits I'm using on my die grinder, the Dremel, and the angle grinder. And I'm basically going to start by, I want of like a V cut going down the center of this piece, and I want to curve over the tops and the bottoms. So I drew a center line on my piece, and it was really just basically a matter of using all these tools, removing it a little bit at a time, and then when you're not working off a drawing, that's just how I like to work. I like to take a little bit off at a time, kind of look at them standing up in perspective of how they would be sitting in a space, and then go back into it. But that center part I worked by making that line and then fanning that line out with bigger bits. So I now have a nice recess going down the middle of my whole piece. That recess I ended up extending all the way to the top and all the way to the bottom. So this is the part with the figure. So like I said, it's a little bit harder on the tools. But once you get most of the material removed with the mechanical tools, I then went through with a hand tool and a sharp chisel, really cleaned up that V-groove. And I have a small V-groove chisel as well, and I kind of cleaned up that V-groove as well with that. So then for the bottom bit, you could see me extending that V-groove down to the bottom, and the design I was going with was kind of, it was going to be a V-groove on the top and the bottom, but it flared out more in the center than it did at the top and the bottom. So then as I went, it was kind of doing this process for a little bit, removing a little bit, sanding a little bit to see what it looks like, because it's hard to tell what things will look like in the end when they're still in the rough. And then I got that pretty much to the point where it was workable. There was going to be some fine tuning left to do on the whole piece, and then I moved to the top, and it was the same thing. I was cutting that groove right through the middle. It ended up giving this piece almost the look of bones, kind of like a humerus or a femur bone, which I liked because when you cut into wood that especially has a nice grain like this, it just reveals that grain a lot more because it's more dimensional than just looking at a flat piece. So by making this groove, it really made that grain and that oak pop. I also did not touch the back side of this because you want that to be flat in order to go against the couch. So you could see I'm just kind of forming these two almost kind of humps at the top part of this piece. And then once again using the orbital sander to kind of smooth everything out and compare it to the two, because once I got this one done, I had to do the second one as well. And then when I had them up in space, I wanted that bottom to not be as pronounced. So you could see I'm just kind of taking down that curve. So it was a matter of putting them next to each other and then adjusting. So you could kind of see the bottom, which is hard to see the depth on film. And then smoothing out the top as well. So this is where this video is going to end. This is only going to be a two-part series, and you could see the side-by-side of the two legs, the one that I started working on, the one that's not finished. And there's still some forming left to do on that first leg, but that is the basic shape that it will stay. And then that's both of them done.